everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your community hour to come to this event. My name is Kathleen Collins. I'm from the library. And, well, thank you. This is the first spring semester library author series event, normally held in the library classroom, which is food and drink free. So my huge heartfelt thanks to the Office for the Advancement of Research for providing this food and beverage for us today. Help yourselves, please. And we're so happy to welcome our first guest author this semester, Michael Brownstein, who is Professor and Chair of Philosophy here at John Jay and Professor of Philosophy at the Graduate Center. His research focuses on the intersection of science, ethics, and social change. He has been a visiting scholar at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. His research has been featured in many outlets, including the New York Times, The Guardian, and Vox. He is the author of The Implicit Mind, Cognitive Architecture, the Self, and Ethics, from Oxford in 2018, co-editor of the two-volume series Implicit Bias and Philosophy, Oxford 2016, and most recently, Somebody Should Do Something, How Anyone Can Help Create Social Change, out now we have to say last year, from MIT Press, with co-authors Alex Madva and Daniel Kelly. That is the book that brings him here today. We will have time for Q&A afterwards. Mark is showing the book, beautiful cover. So please join me in welcoming Michael Brownstein.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. It really is it feels like a special honor to get to talk to you all about what I've been up to and working on for the last couple years. And I'm just really, really grateful to have that opportunity and to see you all. So thank you really again. This book came out in September, but of course I'd been working on it for years with these two guys, Dan Kelly and Alex Madva. They're not here, so you can just assume that whatever is wrong with what I say is their fault. The only thing I really want to say by way of introduction is that this book is a public book. It's the first time I've tried to write a book that's not just a scholarly book that 7 other philosophers will read. In that vein, you'll get a little bit of philosophy here, but a little bit of smattering across the social sciences, hopefully just enough for everyone to find something wrong with. And what I want to actually start with is a brief video, which we describe in the book, but sets the stage for some of the themes that I'm going to talk about. So I'm just going to switch the screen real quick, and it's just like a 1-minute video. You may have seen it before.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it. Write for Pollution Booklet, Box 1771, Radio City Station, New York.
If you don't know, this is called the Crying Indian ad. It debuted in 1971. It's arguably one of the most famous and effective public service announcements ever made. It is widely credited with having been effective in helping to reduce roadside litter, which was a real big problem in the United States at the time. It won all kinds of awards and so on. But there are two ways in which this ad is fraudulent. So one, which you may be familiar with, is about the actor who plays the Indian in it. He went by the name Iron Eyes Cody. If you've seen basically any Western film from the middle of the century, he was probably in it. He co-starred in all kinds of movies with John Wayne and so on. He plays the drum in the background of the song Lakota. He has a Hollywood star. So there's a personal fraud that has to do with him, which is that although he lived his life as a Native American and told everyone about his Cherokee mother and Cree father, and he spent a lot of time giving lectures to Native American groups and admonishing them about the evils of gambling and alcohol, he himself was not, in fact, Native American. His parents were from Sicily. His name was Aspero Oscar de Corti. And oddly enough, his brother was also a lifelong actor who only played Native American roles. The other fraud is less well known, but is probably the more important one, which is that the public service announcement, which was ostensibly aimed at reducing roadside litter, really didn't have that purpose. So you may have caught at the end of the PSA the attribution to a group called Keep America Beautiful. So Keep America Beautiful was formed by a consortium of CEOs from disposable container companies, beer and can and cigarette and chewing gum companies. And what they were up to was trying to head off a problem that they knew they were going to have to deal with, which was that because litter was increasingly a problem as more and more consumers were buying things in disposable packages, some states in the 50s and 60s were starting to pass laws banning the sale of products in disposable containers. So Vermont, for instance, in 1954, banned selling beer in disposable bottles because the glass would apparently cut cows' feet on farms. So the CEOs of these companies saw a problem and they saw the writing on the wall and they wanted to head that off. And that ad was really their masterstroke. And the thinking, the logic was, let's change the conversation and make litter a personal problem, right? Put it on the shoulders of individual people to deal with, right? So people start pollution, people can stop it. And the real genius of this ad is that there's a way in which it's action-oriented. It gives you something to do, right? If you're concerned about the despoiling of the environment, which of course is a really big thing in American consciousness, right at the first Earth Day is going on right around this time, which is the largest single-day protest in American history. They're really giving you a solution, right? Never mind the fact that the solution isn't going to actually change the problem, and the fact that it's going to allow them to keep selling all the disposable trash. It gives you the feeling of having solved the problem. They were actually borrowing from a playbook that was not of their own invention. It goes back farther. In the 1920s, when cars were increasingly all over in the United States, there was a conflict brewing about who the streets belongs to, people or cars. So in the 20s, there was a skyrocketing rate of pedestrian injuries and deaths due to people getting hit by cars. Because at the time, it was much more normal than it is today for people to hang out in the middle of the street, have a conversation, for kids to be running around. And again, the same sort of dynamic was happening. Some towns and cities and states were trying to deal with the problem by passing restrictive legislation. So Cincinnati, for instance, had a ballot referendum in 1924 to install what they called governors in cars that would limit the speed that a car could go to 25 miles an hour. More than 10% of the city voted to have the ballot for the ballot referendum. It's like more than 42,000 people. And an organization called the American Automobile Association organized to prevent this, and the measure failed. And there's a really telling quote from John Hertz, whose name you might recognize, saying, "We are living in a motor age, and we must have not only motor age education, but a motor age sense of responsibility. The streets are for vehicle traffic, the sidewalks for pedestrians. Hertz and his association even wanted to come up with a really handy concept to, again, personalize the problem. And they came up with a term to really put safety on individual people's shoulders. Anyone want to guess what that term is? Jaywalking, that's right. So jaywalking was a neologism. It combined the term jay, which was an epithet for being like a country bumpkin, with walking, right? So a jaywalker is somebody who doesn't know how to safely walk around in the city. They realized that they probably should also have a term for people who are driving irresponsibly, and they actually did a contest for the best term. You probably haven't heard of this one because it didn't stick, but the winner of the contest was a flivverboob. This is also a playbook that has stayed with us today. So again, an example maybe you've heard of. Most people probably are familiar with the idea of a personal carbon footprint. The idea that if you care about climate change, what you can do is mind the emissions associated with your personal activities. You may have also heard that that concept of a personal carbon footprint was popularized by the oil company BP. And again, so this same idea, which some communications scholars call responsibilization, putting problems on the shoulders of individuals. In the last decade or two, I would say, particularly on the progressive left, there has been a pushback against this general cultural idea of responsibilizing complex social problems. And it's the kind of thing where it's like seeing a Volkswagen Beetle, right? Once it's in your mind, you start to see it everywhere. So for instance, if you look in popular writing about climate change, you see a lot of messages like this, right? I work in the environmental movement. I don't care if you recycle. Fight the fossil fuel industry instead, right? So this is a pushback against that individualizing idea. You can't save the climate by going vegan. Corporate polluters must be held accountable, writes Michael Mann, an influential climate scientist. It's not just about climate, though. So this is a doctor writing about the diabetes epidemic in the United States. And he says, our entire society is perfectly designed to create type 2 diabetes. There is no device, no drug powerful enough to counter the effects of poverty, pollution, stress, a broken food system, cities that are hard to navigate on foot, and inequitable access to healthcare, particularly in minority communities. He's working in the vein of this research that's called the social determinants of health model, right? And again, here the message is, stop focusing so much on individual solutions like dieting and exercise, right? And fix the putative source of the problem, whether it's any of those things on the list. Or if you think of another topic like political misinformation, right? This is a big one in our discussion and world today. Here's a philosopher, Dan Williams, writing in the Boston Review. There will be sharp limits to individual level solutions for combating misinformation. The real challenges likely reside at the systemic and political levels. For example, we must build more trustworthy institutions that can win people's confidence, and we must address the social and political conditions that make people avid consumers of partisan and conspiratorial content. In scholarly work, this same idea has been taken up. This is the banner of a really widely shared paper that two behavioral scientists, Nick Chater and George Lowenstein, wrote in the journal Behavioral and Brain Science. It was downloaded over 17,000 times. And what they do is they contrast across a whole slew of topics, including the ones I mentioned and many others besides, this contrast between what they call I-frame or individual level solutions and S-frame or system level solutions. And in all of these cases, they sort of make the argument that I-frame solutions are ineffective and S-frame solutions are really where the action is. And behavioral scientists have been sort of duped into looking too much into I-frame solutions for many decades. They have now a new book that just came out last week, which makes this case, right, tellingly titled, It's on You, right? And that's the problem that they want to identify, again, how this whole stream of thinking has put these sorts of problems on our individual shoulders. What I would say is the core gist of their argument, right, is that they say history shows the solution to individual frailty is to change the system, not to enhance the individual. Or maybe as Elizabeth Warren gets it best and most succinctly, right, in her 2020 slogan, right, I want big structural change. So this is the conversation that we wanted to intervene on in this book, this setup of a contrast between individual solutions for complex global problems and systemic solutions. And what we did, Dan and Alex and I, is we wrote a couple scholarly articles about specific topics, climate change, reducing racial prejudice, and then we decided to write the book that sort of encompasses lots of different problems and takes the discussion at a slightly higher level of abstraction. The core problem we have with this dialogue is that it frames any kind of solution to a complex problem as either or, right? So here's maybe the best distillation of that either or thinking from social psychologists Keith Payne and Heidi Vuletich, who say solutions need to focus on structuring the social context rather than changing the beliefs or values of individuals. And it's that rather than that we think is mistaken. So what it does is it sets up a number of either-or dilemmas. So just to kind of give you some clear examples to keep in your mind throughout the rest of the talk. Either you can fret about your personal carbon footprint because that's something that's in your control, even if it's not going to really make a dent in global warming. Or let's say you can argue for a carbon tax, right, which is a policy lever that economists tell us is really the most effective thing. If you're concerned about diabetes, you can eat healthy, or you can teach other people to eat healthy food, or you can say study what kinds of federal policies are best at reducing poverty or income inequality. If you're interested in misinformation, right, you can focus on teaching people and students digital literacy, or you can try to regulate social media companies, right? So these are the sorts of either-or dilemmas that we think have got something wrong. And so what we are going to try to do in the book is give you what we'll call a both-and picture. But just 1 second before I give you that picture, just to kind of give a little bit more flesh on the bones of what we mean by the individualist and the structuralist sides of the ledger. This is a famous early Earth Day poster that I think captures the individual ethos, which I would just define simply as the idea that personal choices cause the problem for any of these problems. And individuals can take action by recycling or driving an EV or whatever, right? Whatever's in your personal power to do. There's a vein of empirical literature that I think proceeds within this broad ethos, and it generally proceeds by trying to identify individual differences that shape people's personal choices. So those might be their beliefs. If you're talking about climate change, just to run it through that example, it might be their political attitudes, it might be their personality variables or their moral frameworks. And then there's a whole stream of philosophical work that proceeds in this vein as well. Questions like, what are our personal moral obligations to future generations? Or are we hypocrites if, say, we claim to care about climate change, but we drive a gas-guzzling SUV? The structuralist ethos that I've already tried to describe is usually set up as anti-individualist, which is to say it starts with the criticism that focusing too much on personal responsibility is distracting and ineffective. Whereas the real source of the problem isn't in individuals, but faulty rules of the road, as the economist Douglas North put it, right? And those could refer to a broad suite of, say, incentives, laws, policies, cultures, even broad political economy. Roughly as a heuristic, you might think of those rules of the road as sort of anything outside of individual heads. Empirical research here is in some sense exactly the inverse. So the idea is to hold individual differences constant and to look for variables that shape outcomes aside from those differences. So you might look at, say, government types, right? If you're interested in climate change, do democracies versus authoritarian states have better climate outcomes? You might look at physical infrastructure, right? Do cities versus smaller rural areas have more emissions? Policy design, etc. Philosophical questions here, again, have quite a different flavor from the individualist ones, right? Often the question is like, deep down, what's the root of the problem, right? Or questions like, if only everyone was rational, what would they truly want, right? Okay, I just want to nod to the fact that these are very old themes going back all the way to the work of people like Durkheim and Marx. And if you're interested in sort of the history of the social sciences and how the different fields within the social sciences developed, I think you can do really interesting work tracing different attitudes toward the relationship between individual agency and social structures. I would say what we're trying to do in the book that I think is new is take that relationship and focus it on the question, what can people do who want to make change, right? So the book is very forward-looking. It's very hopefully actionable and solutions-oriented, right? But by starting with this question, how should we think about the relationship between our personal choices and the systems and the structures that shape our personal choices? So for the rest of the talk, what I'll do is give you a few reasons to be worried about the either-or dilemma, the way that this is typically set up in public dialogue. And then I'll turn to some ways you might adopt what we call the both-and perspective and sort of the positive part of the project. So the first argument for why you should be worried about setting up solutions in this either-or way is that it's vague. So let me give you some examples. So suppose you're interested in an incentive program that makes it easier for people to buy heat pumps and electric bikes and so on, right? Is that a structuralist approach because it's public policy, or is it individualist because it encourages people to reduce their personal carbon footprints? Or suppose you volunteer to do some phone banking for a political candidate. Is that structuralist because it's endeavoring to form collective action? Is it individualist because it aims to persuade individual voters? You can't really see that too well, sorry. But suppose you're interested in research on what leads people to put solar panels on their roofs. Is that structuralist because when people put panels up, other people can see them, and so you're changing the social environment? Or is it individualist because it's targeting individuals in virtue of being consumers? We use the metaphor of the famous duck rabbit in the book to sort of capture this idea. So this is like one of the more famous concepts in cognitive psychology, right? You can look at it one way and see a duck. You can look at it another way and see a rabbit. What you can't do is see a duck and a rabbit at the same time. And what we argue in the book is that, look, if someone asked you, okay, but like at the end of the day, deep down, is it really a duck or is it really a rabbit? You would say, that question doesn't really make sense, right? At the end of the day, it's a duck rabbit. You can look at it and see it one way or the other, and that might be a helpful framing metaphor for kind of training your attention, but it's not really one or the other. And we make the case that it's the same with individual and structural level solutions for social problems. They are useful heuristics for paying attention to different features of our world, different features of choice and agency. But at the end of the day, these are not distinct metaphysical categories that we can easily separate out. Second problem is a problem of agency or motivation. So here's a quote from a really terrific political scientist who does work on climate change, who says, "Yes, it's great to drive an electric vehicle if you can afford it and purchase solar panels if powerful utilities in your state haven't conspired to make renewable energy more expensive. But the point is that interest groups have structured the choices available to us today. Individuals don't have the agency to steer our economic ship from the passenger deck," right? So I think this is a sort of standard structuralist sort of move. And the problem here is that, at least on my lights, it's incredibly demotivating, right? The message is effectively, The things that are in control in your life, like, buying an electric car or reducing your carbon footprint in one way or another, are really just meant to make you feel better, right? They're meant to make you feel as if you're making a difference, but they don't actually do anything. They don't make a meaningful dent. The things that would really change anything, right? Restructuring the energy economy. What do I know about that, right? It takes the solutions to the problem and makes them very far from any of our day-to-day lives, right? I know how to ride a bike. I do not know how to take down the fossil fuel industry. So something has gone amiss if the message is you as an individual have no agency over the problem that you are concerned with. A third problem with the either-or setup is that there is a long and very sort of terrific history of structural changes to societies leading to unintended consequences or backlash, right? Maybe in American history, one of the best examples being prohibition, right? So the temperance movement was an incredible model of organizing. They were actually, one thing we learned in doing research for the book, they were the inspiration for the NRA, another really effective organizing group. The temperance movement worked for decades, nearly a century, right? And what they managed to do was, like, by our lights today, unthinkable in terms of structural change. They amended the Constitution of the United States. Like, think how difficult that, nobody talks about that today as even remotely possible, right? So that's like the biggest, deepest, most like heavy structural lever you could imagine turning today. And what happened? Nobody liked it. It led to organized crime. It was always unpopular. And about 10 years later, for the only time ever, we amended the Constitution again to unamend it. Right? So there is nothing guaranteed in structural change that makes it work or last, right? It has to be connected up with or in sync with people's hearts and minds, what people like and want, and so on. This is, I think, relevant, again, in the contemporary context where carbon pricing, to just use that example again, is really like the favored policy tool of economists, and yet nowhere in the world has it really worked because people don't like it, right? It's a tax, and people don't like taxes. And so I think this is sort of like maybe it's a stretch to say contemporary incarnation of prohibition, but driving in the same lane. The last objection I want to make about the either-or way of thinking is what we call in the book the return of the allegedly irrelevant. And the example I'll use to make the case here is about integration. So if you don't know this book, Elizabeth Anderson is a terrific philosopher who wrote this book in 2010, The Imperative of Integration. And the setup of the book is that it starts with a really interesting exploration of psychological research on prejudice reduction. And where Anderson lands is that there's really no hope for reducing racial inequities in our country by psychological approaches to prejudice reduction alone, if we are not also changing the systems and structures that people live within, right? So if we are segregated in terms of where we live and where we work and status and education, right, then the sort of project of training people's stereotypes away is hopeless. That's her argument. That's the setup for what she wants to say is the imperative of integration. So in some ways, this is like a case for those of you who are familiar with social psychology, a case for the contact hypothesis, the idea that prejudice is really reduced when people live and work together and interact on relatively equal status. Where the argument goes awry, in my view, in our view in the book, is that Anderson comes to this place of saying, okay, so we have to support and argue for integration policies that are going to overcome residential segregation and other forms of segregation. Right? What she doesn't explore is that arguably the greatest impediment to those sorts of policies being successfully implemented in our country are individuals' prejudices, right? So it does not take being a historian to know that like the difficulty of implementing, say, something like the Supreme Court's decision in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education was decades of fighting back by prejudiced people, right? As the Little Rock Nine would have told you before any of this started, right? And it lasted for decades in fights about busing programs and of course up until today, right? Where our schools are just as segregated as they were in the 50s. If you want really a searing account of white people's pushback to integration policies, listen to Nicole Hannah-Jones's investigation of the school district in St. Louis, the Normandy School District, where there was a plan to merge two high schools. And it was like a win-win for everybody. And yet there was this incredible pushback in these town halls where people said things like, we are talking about violent behavior that's going to be coming in with my first grader. I shopped for a school district. I deserve to not have to worry about my children getting stabbed or taking a drug or getting robbed. We don't want the different areas coming across on our side of the bridge, bringing with it everything that we're fighting today against. Maybe it's unsurprising to everyone in this room that individual prejudice stands in the way of something like school integration, but there's actually all kinds of research showing how it stands in the way of policies that you might not think are all that relevant to race. So, for instance, the political scientist Michael Tesler has great research that we talk about in the book about racial prejudice driving opposition to Obamacare. And he's really able to isolate prejudice levels driving people's opposition to, a healthcare program which is at least not facially about race in the way that integration is, right? So the argument here is structural solutions are no end around individual prejudices, right? Because once you start thinking seriously about how to implement successfully structural fixes to problems like climate or racial inequity or healthcare, what you find are individual prejudices standing in the way. Okay, so enough criticism. I'm going to pivot now and try to talk about some ways that we flesh out in the book how to be what we call a both-and thinker about social change. We take being a both-and social change maker to be grounded in learnable skills that people can cultivate, or what we call structure-facing virtues. And if you want a definition, we give one in a paper. These are dispositions to notice and act upon situational influences on our minds. We contrast it with the sort of traditional philosophical conception of virtues as individual excellencies for interpersonal interaction. So these are ways of interacting with the systems and structures that organize our lives. I want to tell you about the first one by briefly describing a story that we tell in the book. There's lots of stories in the book. So this is Funmilayo Ransom Kuti. She was the mother of Fela Kuti, who maybe you've heard of, famed Afrobeat musician. In her day, she was more famous than her son. She was born into a relative life of privilege in a small area of Nigeria. She was always a do-gooder. From a young age, she wanted to sort of help figure out how to make people's lives better. And in 1932, she founded the Abeokuta Ladies Club, which focused on self-improvement, trying to teach the village women ways of making themselves better. And it focused on like sewing and etiquette and literacy. But as she grew up and came to learn more about the world around her, she's living in colonial Nigeria at the time, she got radicalized. And she came to learn about the way the system was set up and the ways in which it was set up to take advantage of the women in her world. And in 1946, she changed it into the Abeokuta Women's Union. And what we try to do is tell the story of her structural turn, right? Her becoming aware of the structural injustices in the world around her. And she became instrumental in fights for Nigerian independence, which was won in 1960. and women's suffrage in Nigeria, which incredibly was not universal until 1979, the year after she was killed by the government. So the idea here is that the first sort of virtue is seeing structures, right? Paying attention, learning about them in the world around us. Now, you don't have to be a revolutionary like Funmilayo Kuti to do this. So suppose that you're interested in bicycle commuting, right? For good reason. Bike lanes reduce pollution, they make people happier, they make cities safer, right? But of course, it's difficult to make the case for bike commuting in a place like New York City, where we don't have great bike infrastructure, because you're not going to tell people that, like, well, you have to do this even if you feel like you're taking your life in your hands every time you go to work. Right? So that would seem to sort of present people with an either-or dilemma, right? Either you might teach people how to ride safely, taking the world as it is, right, that we have the infrastructure we have, or maybe you call for better bicycle infrastructure, right? And say, no, like, don't worry about your personal decisions. What we need is to change the infrastructure of the city. But I think there's an alternative, which is what I would call a both-and perspective, which is that we can teach people how safe cycling requires better infrastructure, right? And also how to lobby their government to create that infrastructure, right? So the idea is, like, just as Funmilayo Kuti did not abandon the idea of personal responsibility or the importance of personal decisions, she just redirected it from sewing to suffrage, right? Here too, the idea is to redirect personal decisions from the only one, like, do I ride a bike and give up on the idea of cycling infrastructure, to one of, like, how can I change that infrastructure? What role can I play in making it different? It's not enough, of course, to just know about social structures, right? You have to understand them and have a correct understanding of them. We wrote this book before the latest presidential election, and in some ways, you know, the sort of conversation about which side of the political aisle is the party of structural change has changed. I would argue that right now the Republican Party is the party most involved with changing the structures of American society, and in some ways Democrats are having to learn how to be conservative, small c conservative, right? To, like, care about conserving basic tenets of liberal democracy, like the rule of law. So I only give this example to say that, like, there are people out there who want to change social systems, but in my view have the wrong understanding of how those systems work or what ought to change. The way we treat this in the book is actually by looking at developmental psychology and work on how, from a really shocking young age, kids soak up information about existing social hierarchies, as I think this photograph does a nice job of capturing. So kids infer hierarchy from the regularities that they see around them. But the crucial point is that they don't all come to the same conclusions, right? So some kids grow up and come to have essentialized beliefs about existing social hierarchies, that the way things are right now is natural, maybe even just. Other kids grow up to question the existing hierarchies that they have come to observe. So that, to us, is an opportunity to be what we call a social change entrepreneur, right, in our daily lives, and that's as parents. Right? So there's also really interesting work in developmental psychology showing that parents' comfort with existing social hierarchies predicts their kids' prejudices, their preference for diverse classrooms, and their charitableness to outgroups, to kids that they perceive as being in a different group from their own, right? So the idea here is that you don't just have to see structures, right? You've got to understand them correctly, and you also have to see those structures as changeable. We are probably all familiar with the concept of growth mindsets, right? The idea that our skills and our abilities are not fixed. We're not necessarily born with them, right? But they are learnable and changeable. There's a lot of criticism of growth mindset literature. So Chater and Lowenstein, the behavioral and brain science guys, say this. Much of behavioral scientists' work on education inequality has focused not on changing the system, but on helping individual students. They think this is a bad thing. Shifting students' attributions of outcomes from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. The problem in their view is that there's a whole slew of literature showing that growth mindset interventions don't really work. It's very difficult to find reliable effects of trying to teach growth mindsets. But I think that it's too quick to just say that's the end of the story. So what are some both and alternatives to this? One is to look at when growth mindset interventions do seem to work and when they don't. And it looks like there's some reason to think that they do work when kids are in the right environment, right? When they have that relationship between the individual and the system in the right sort of a way. And one way is when they are around teachers who themselves have growth mindsets. So teachers who adopt growth mindsets do a better job of inculcating those mindsets into their students. So we use this sort of seed and soil metaphor in the book to get at that. One way you could think of that alternatively is that you can be the situation, right? The system or the structure, the social milieu for other people, right? This is probably, familiar to all the teachers in the room. It's also possible to cultivate growth mindsets toward social institutions and arrangements, right? To adopt the belief that those institutions and arrangements can change. This is a version of what some people call counterfactual thinking, right? The disposition to think about how things could be if they were, if something had been changed. And I know of no more eloquent description of counterfactual thinking than one Isabel Wilkerson gave, where she wrote, "On those cotton fields were opera singers, jazz musicians, playwrights, novelists, surgeons, attorneys, accountants, professors, journalists. We know that because that's what they and their children and now their grandchildren and even their great-grandchildren have often chosen to become once they had the chance to choose for themselves." So seeing structures, understanding structures, and seeing structures as changeable are all essential ingredients, but yet not enough, because of course we have to be willing to try to change things, right? To challenge the status quo. And that can be difficult because human beings have a disposition to find the status quo satisfactory. So John Jost, a really compelling social psychologist, calls this system justification, that people are motivated to defend the status quo and to find it just, even when they are disadvantaged by it. But it's crucial to know that, again, this is not all people equally. And so we went looking for examples of people who really display the virtue of willingness to challenge the status quo. And what we looked at were people who speak up against injustice when they really have skin in the game, like when it's really risky. And so we found a really great body of research, for instance, interviewing people who had demonstrated in the Arab Spring, and what led them, right, to go out and to speak up when they really faced grave repercussions for doing so. And what this one researcher, Aaron Ayanian, found is that some of the things are what you might expect. So people who speak up in high-risk environments have certain ideological beliefs. They don't feel as threatened necessarily as the rest of us do. But she found one thing that we really found surprising and meaningful, which is that people don't tend to go to like a demonstration believing that they are, like that demonstration is gonna be the one that breaks the dam. That like they don't have particularly unrealistic beliefs that the revolution is about to happen or whatever. What they do have unusually strong beliefs in is that they can be helpful to the other people who are there, right? They can help make their neighbor safer or their friend safer, right? I think this is another way of describing what activists talk about as solidarity, right? They are there for their community members. And it's really interesting that she found this in these cohorts because it's very consistent with another body of research in political science that finds, this is Mississippi Freedom Riders, and political scientist Doug McAdam wrote this very famous paper comparing people who signed up for the freedom rides and went versus people who signed up and didn't show up. And he wanted to know, like, what's the difference, right? And what he found is that the people who went, they didn't have different beliefs necessarily. They didn't, again, think that like they had agentic powers that the no-shows didn't have. What they had were more what he called micro-social structures. They had more organizational ties, they were part of groups and so on, and they had more relationships with other activists, with other freedom riders. So again, they were there for their community members, for their friends, and so on. And I think this is honestly what we're seeing in Minnesota today, where we see this explosion of mutual aid amongst ordinary people who are showing up because their friend down the street or their buddy at the deli or whatever is threatened. And so I think it's a real core lesson about what gets people sort of out the door and really willing to show up for a more just world. Okay, just two more and then I'll stop. We talk a lot about what you might think of as signaling your virtue. Now, I put it this way because I want to plant a certain idea in your mind, which is virtue signaling, which is commonly thought of as a bad thing. And there are certainly forms of virtue signaling that people rightly don't like, right? So when Nancy Pelosi and other congressional leaders knelt in the Capitol Rotunda wearing kente cloth, there was a huge backlash, right? People found it inauthentic. They thought they were in it for the attention and the clicks and so on, and maybe rightly so. But I think of this kind of virtue signaling as a specific example of a broader way of signaling our virtue to one another, which I actually think is a crucial form of social influence. The economist Robert Frank has this great book, Under the Influence, which documents lots of forms of social influence. And it caught my attention because I heard him tell this story or sort of give his spin on a familiar example, which I loved. So think of secondhand smoking. Why is secondhand smoking dangerous? I think the familiar thought is that, like, you go to a restaurant and someone else lights up a cigarette and that smoke gets into your lungs and it can make you sick, right? And that's true, it's not like wrong. But Frank's view is that the real danger of secondhand smoking is that it is based on permitting people to smoke in public places, which makes smoking seem normal and even cool and natural. So the real danger of secondhand smoking is that it makes more smokers. Frank tries to take this idea and turn it on its head as a way of making change, or what he calls using behavioral contagion as a form of change making. So just to stick with the smoking example, for instance, he draws on research from Nick Christakis and Fowler that when people in your life quit smoking is when you quit smoking, right? So people are 24% more likely to quit when a sibling quits, 36% more likely to quit when a close friend quits, 67% more likely to quit after a spouse quits. So this is the power of social influence, and it's of course not limited to smoking. If you want to look at how to get people to vote, a really powerful way is to have them live with people who vote. This is a really neat randomized control trial looking at college dorm mates and their effect on each other and their voting rates over time. And they find that the effect is commensurate to the effect of parenting, right? So parents tend to have kids who vote. College dorm mates who vote tend to have dorm mates who vote, right? And again, that's that idea of social influence. It's also a fascinating explanation for why people put solar panels on their roof. One of the best ways to predict who will put solar panels on their roof is to look and see if their neighbors have. So this is research on the peer influence on solar diffusion. I think the familiar way of thinking about like what difference can I make, and again to keep with the climate example, is to just ask like how many pounds of greenhouse gas can I personally prevent from going in the atmosphere by doing X, Y, or Z. But what I'm trying to push here is to think in terms of social influence instead, right? Who can I affect by putting solar panels on my roof or riding my bike to work or doing anything else that I'm considering? And the both and way of thinking about this is which personal choices can I make to create the most social influence, right? Again, we are all someone else's situation, right? And we can use that as a way of being integrated into the social atmosphere, the social milieu, as a way of being an effective agent of change. Another person whose situation you can be is your future self. So one form of criticism that you see in the either-or sort of vein of thinking is that small deeds lead to moral licensing, right? So like, if I don't eat bacon today, I can jump on that transatlantic flight without feeling guilty, right? Because I've like washed my hands of my obligation to do something good for the day, right? Or I read that article about housing inequality, so now I don't really have to bother going to that tenant association meeting or whatever. But it's possible that small deeds act more like a foot in the door to bigger deeds down the line. And there's an interesting nascent stream of research trying to figure out when it goes which way, when the spillover from the first thing you do to the second thing you do is positive or negative. And some, I think, promising research, again, in the climate space is it looks like when people buy an energy-efficient appliance, it increases their support for grid-scale wind projects. That's a causal effect, not just correlational. When people put rooftop solar installations on their house, this was in Germany, it increases vote share for the Green Party in that area, right? So there's lots more to sort of study here, but it's pushing in the direction that I'm trying to describe. Okay, and the last thing I'll just describe is the importance of thinking about our individual roles for creating social change based on who we are, what we know, what we do in our lives. I've talked about how laws and institutions and systems affect us and how important it is to learn about that. I've talked about skills-based approaches to changing collective practices. And now just in closing, I'll just say something real briefly about how we can find roles for each of us to play in trying to create transformative change. So I've told you about some people we profile in the book, like Funmilayo Kuti. We talk about people whose goals I don't share. So that's Harlan Carter, who was the genius behind the NRA's legislative strategy. And to make a really long story short, what he did was cultivate a group identity around gun ownership. And he incentivized all these ways for people to sort of connect with each other and to define themselves as part of the gun-owning community. And then he leveraged that for a reliable voting bloc with ties to congressional elites and so on. We tell the story of Janice Leitner, who started Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which is arguably one of the most effective citizen action groups of the last 50 years. Everyone has heard of MAD. They were instrumental in not only changing laws, but changing culture around drinking and driving. And how she did it is a really fascinating story, and it kind of is uncomfortable in some ways, because what they did is they really took advantage of the individualist ethos. They were working in the sort of Reagan-Thatcher era, and what they wanted to do was really vilify drunk drivers, right? To put the problem on their shoulders. But I think the lesson here is that our social change endeavors need to pay very close attention to how people think, what motivates them, and what they care about, and she was really masterful about that. We tell the story of Chris Smalls, who started off being an aspiring basketball player, and then hip-hop musician, and then found himself as a picker at an Amazon warehouse. He was fired when he and some coworkers demanded better protective gear during the pandemic, and they staged a walkout, and then they decided to try to organize a union, and they ended up being the first successful unionization effort at an Amazon warehouse in the country. And when he and his fellow organizers talk about what they think the crucial element was, they talk about the presence of being there every day and getting to know all their workers. They had a table set out at the exit where they just hung out with people as they left. They hung out in the break room and listened to people about what their concerns were. And they created a social network, which then gave birth to the union at JFK 8 in Staten Island. The last thought, though, I'll leave you with is, of course, all of these people are people who dedicated their whole lives to trying to create change, and I don't want to leave you with the message that I think that's the only thing that makes a difference. we are all embedded in various social networks, right? All of us fit into some of these categories or others, which means that we have situations, other people's situations that we can help shape, right? That we can play the role of changing the atmosphere in which they make their choices. And that really provides an opportunity to be an agent of social change. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you so much, and I'd love to hear what you think. And totally no worries if you've got to go.
Questions?
Thanks, that was great. I really appreciated the talk. I have two concerns. One is you can apply all of this to any issue, and people have already done that, as you pointed out, on the opposite side. So I'm not sure how it guarantees making things better rather than just providing ammunition for everyone. And the other is, and it's sort of in the same vein, that there's been concerns about, say, climate change for a very long time. And that was met with this kind of organizational pushback that you describe. And all it had to do was delay the effect long enough. And now there's what's called climate optimists amongst climate researchers. And if you read climate optimist stuff, it's depressing as all get out. It describes a minimum of 250 million people being displaced, and that's the optimistic view. So in light of this pushback and the fact that any kind of stalling works against us, like, how do we respond to those problems?
Thanks. So on your first question about sort of, proprietary lessons in social change, you're absolutely right. I mean, any of the, can you all hear that? Any of the things we say are, I think, I don't know what to do. I'm still. I don't think there's any essential link between the tools that we are arguing for and what I would consider just ends. Maybe someone could find a case to make that there are ways to create change that guarantee that they're used for good, but I've not seen it. I guess the best I can offer you. I wonder why it didn't happen for. What if I took this out? Because I think they need the mic for the recording.
Is this one? Oh, okay, yep.
Ah. Okay. I guess the only kind of hope I can give you in terms of that first question is just that, I doubt lots of Republicans or conservatives are going to read this book. And so, I hope the message finds the right audience from my perspective. But I do think, like I said in using the lesson of, say, the NRA, that the point goes in reverse, which is I want to learn all the tools I can for making change, even if at other times and places they have been used for ends that I find objectionable. On the second question, sometimes when I've given talks about this book, people have, they want to sell it when they introduce me or whatever, and they say, the book is really optimistic. And my skin crawls when people say that, because I'm not particularly an optimist. I kind of find optimism and pessimism overconfident, right? I have no idea where we're going in the future. I'm not in the prediction business. But I think with anything, and in particular with climate change, no matter how bad it looks like it could be, and you're absolutely right, the more the energy transition is delayed, the worse the effects are going to be. It seems to me we are still in exactly the same position, which is we have to do whatever we can, right? We have to fight as hard as we can to make a just world. And so I'm comfortable calling the book forward-looking, practical, maybe even hopeful, but action-orienting is really what I want to say. And without a doubt, the climate movement has suffered setback after setback. when we were writing it, I will say, was right after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, and things looked a particular way in this country that they don't look right now. I don't think that really invalidates too many of the arguments I've made, but it does certainly make things look dire, and boy, there are lots of reasons to feel things are dire right now. Yeah, please.
So thank you. This is really interesting. I guess I have a brief version of my question. I'll do that one first to see if it takes off, and you can answer it. To what extent is the problem that you are presenting us with here a first world problem? In other words, well, I could go on, but for example, the notion that there are societies in which individual agency is much more limited, and in which structural change is what you absolutely need to do. The two examples that you have, Nigeria and the Arab Spring, were not about bike lanes. Right? They were about fundamental structural change. So I guess I'm asking, to what extent does this translate to outside of the first world?
Great. Thank you. That's a great question. And I don't have a simple answer, but I'll give you some thoughts that maybe just point in different directions. I mean, one way in which it is a story about first world and particular American political problems is that even though I gave you some examples in this talk that are from around the world, I would say most of the literature and examples we work with in the book are in the American context. Just is what it is. Another way in which I think it is provincial is that the discourse about individual versus structural forms of change, I think exists very much within the sort of European American contemporary intellectual tradition. Although there are, I think, really interesting strands of thought that connect up with various things we say in the book outside of that tradition, and we get into some of them a little bit here and there. I think the way in which it's not provincial is I think that the choices faced with anybody, any individual who wants to work for change, and to figure out how their personal choices can connect up with the laws and the policies and the political economies that either dominate their lives or their country person's lives or organize their choices and so on. This sort of question about the individual systemic relations, I don't think that's one that's embedded in any particular time or place. But I do think it comes out in the way people think in different ways in different places. So we do talk in the book quite a bit, and I didn't really get into it here just in the interest of time, about just how much that whole story I gave you about responsibilization and corporations kind of seeding the message that it's all on you. Another part of that story is that it found a very willing audience in American individualism, right? So American culture is probably the most individualistic culture there ever was. And there's all kinds of fascinating evidence about that, right? From our, from the sort of up by our bootstraps mentality to even if you do analyses of corpuses of words, Americans use words like I and mine more than people from other cultures. So part of that story is a propaganda story, I think, but part of that story is that it found a very willing audience in a very individualistic culture, and I think that would play out quite differently in other places in the world. So I get that I'm not giving you a straight answer, but those are some themes of what I would say. Thank you.
Thanks. Great talk, wonderful talk, lots to think about. What strikes me also is that in comparing the individual versus the structural, is that human beings are extremely bad at estimating. So we're both bad at estimating our own impact, time we spend on things, what we believe even we're not so good at, but we're exceptionally bad at estimating long-term existential type problems. So when you think about like encouraging people to participate in, get the foot in the door that leads to larger change,
Yeah.
how would you help us think about how we get people to understand their impact
Yeah.
and really estimate their impact? So both, because I remember listening to you on one of the podcasts saying, like, you have to celebrate success along the way because this is definitely a marathon, not a sprint, but how to know when you've been successful and when it's not enough,
Yeah.
and when it is enough.
Yeah, good. Thanks so much for that question. I'll try to remember to say, I think, 3 things. So one is that we talk some in the book about what social scientists call the problem of pluralistic ignorance, which is just a fancy term for how we are bad at estimating what other people know or believe, right? And we often mistake minority positions for majority positions. There's one survey that we talk about that asks people to estimate what level of support other Americans have for climate legislation. And when you ask people, the average guess of what they think other people think is that they think like a third of Americans want better climate legislation. But then when you actually just survey Americans, it's like 2/3 want better stronger climate legislation, right? So people get it exactly backwards. And there's like a century's worth of research on pluralistic ignorance. You're exactly right. We're really bad at estimating what people think in lots and lots of contexts. I think you're also right that we are bad at estimating our own impacts, right? So one of the ways that we frame it is that I think a familiar kind of demotivating thought is like, how do I know what the chances of success are if I'm going to show up at my community board meeting to lobby for some change, or I'm going to show up at the protest, right? Like, it seems like it's totally unpredictable that some big thing is going to happen. It could be a million years off in the future, right? But that uncertainty can go in the other direction, which is to say, the big thing might be right around the corner, and you just didn't know it, right? You might say something to your neighbor that inspires them to take action in a way that you never could have predicted. And so I think what I take from that is there's a kind of humility that is in order, that we really can't predict what effects we might have on someone else or some other group. And that can be told as a way of thinking like, well, is it worth doing anything? But it can also be told as a way of like, maybe it's worth doing something, and you just don't know, right? The spark that lights the fire might just be the next one. So I think it's like more a matter of what disposition you're coming in with than there's some objective way of measuring like your chances of success. Yeah, Mark?
I have a non-content question. And first I would say thanks for this, but also thanks for writing I doubt if I need this. Thanks for also writing a very readable book and reader-friendly book. And I want to ask a question about that because it seems to me important about how you work with other knowledge makers and other writers. And could you give us some advice perhaps about what that process was like, or describe what that process was like, and what worked about working with these other 2 authors that allowed you to create this public-facing book?
Why, Mark? Why did you ask that question? It wasn't easy, to be completely honest with you. I've done a lot of co-authoring with both these particular people and others, but always for scholarly work. And I've been lucky that that's always been pretty seamless and frictionless. And for me, co-writing is a much more pleasurable process than doing it myself. I get a lot of the like dark night of the soul kind of stuff when I try to write on my own and do research on my own. And collaborating with people kind of just solved that for whatever reason. For me, it felt better. But what was new about this is, like you said, we were trying to write something that would be fun to read. There's a lot of jokes in here. There's a lot of like, we tried to make it enjoyable. And what we didn't really anticipate was that when you try to do that with other people, you have to negotiate not just arguments, which we're very used to as academics, but negotiate like aesthetic judgments as well, right? Yeah, voice, tone, does a joke work? And I'm sure, I'm sure most people have had this experience. You can't really argue about that stuff, right? Because someone says, I think the joke is funny, and then someone else says, why? And then you say, I don't know, it just does, it works, or it doesn't work, I don't like it. And you have no reasons to navigate. And so the book took a really long time and went through many, many, many drafts because of that kind of the difficulty of figuring out how to write for the public with people who have different views about what good public writing is. I would pass. I'll answer that question. I mean, I would write. Yeah, I don't know. It's too soon. Too soon. Yeah, I don't. We might be out of time, but are we out of time? I can't see the clock very well.
Let me ask a related question about
Okay.
the title.
Yeah.
Tell us about
Well, so apropos of Mark's question, we fought about the title for like 2 years. And the document on my computer of potential title ideas is ridiculously long. I think ultimately we're all pretty happy with where we landed. Some people think the book is called Somebody, 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 Somebody Should Do Something, which is a little unfortunate, I guess. Yeah, man, titles are really hard. And we talked to journalists, we talked to editors at big newspapers, we talked to the marketing department at the press, and what I'll tell you is I think they were all full of shit. Like, every one of them is like, this is the principle you should use, and it was totally opposite from the principle that this other so-called expert would tell you. And so I think you just kind of need to find it, and hopefully it sounds good. Yeah. Hey, Janice. Yeah, of course.
And I train girls to be change makers.
Amazing.
And I wrote a book, a trade press book for Random House on how to raise change-making girls.
I love it. I didn't know this book. I'll have to check it out.
So part of the book centers on the basic premise is that the locus of control, if you want to change the world, you can do this through parenting. And so in listening to you talk today,
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please.
So I'm wondering for me, the question is, where did that come into place? Did it show up in your conversations and in your questions? This kind of early civilization of voice action. And the second question is related to, where do you think, or how did your work in Clear help people see structure? Right? Because what we have found is that some people find it quite difficult to see the presence of structure there, and a problem that you might think is a structural problem, they think is largely an individual problem.
Great, thanks. Those are both great questions. We do write about parenting. I wouldn't say it's like the focal point of any one chapter, but it comes up in some of like the examples that I talked briefly about here, drawing on some of the developmental psychology literature, particularly around prejudice reduction. And then we talk some when we have the chapter at the end about social roles and talk about parenting as a change-making role. So I definitely will read your book to learn, sort of more ways to think about that. I will say, a question I've gotten in lots of events around the book is like, well, what have I changed in my life as a result of having read this? And one thing I think about is my role as a parent. My kids are definitely sick of being dragged to protests and things like that. The only other thing I would say is, one of the things I want to resist is the impulse to find firsts, to think like, well, this is the thing that drives everything else. And so, people will sometimes say like, it all goes back to education, or it all goes back to secure attachment, or whatever, right? And I think that there's like a deep truth in any of those examples. But you can always ask a question like, well, what enabled those parents to create a secure attachment for their kids? And what you will always find are both individual and systemic factors that made that possible, right? So those parents perhaps had the material security to invest in their kids and to raise them right, and so on. So there's kind of always a step back and a step back and a step back and a step back that you can take. The second question you asked was about seeing structure, right? Yeah, so I think this connects up with the question about living in a highly individualistic culture. So I think that like what it means to cultivate the virtue of seeing structure is going to probably look different in different places and in different communities and cultures, even within, say, the United States. Because somebody who is raised to think in highly individualistic terms is going to find that challenging and threatening, right, in ways that people who were raised with different ideals aren't. And so I don't think there's like a formula for it, but I do think it's a sort of crucial ingredient in the menu. Yeah. I think we should probably stop. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Thank you all so much. It was really a pleasure.